Romeo and Juliet, Part 3. Banished, Comfort and Counsel. When Juliet hastened to Friar Lawrence's cell to be married to Romeo, her nurse went off in another direction to secure a ladder of cords so that the young husband might visit his wife that evening, and speak to her with less danger of discovery than if she were up in the balcony and he below in the orchard. This nurse of Juliet's was a talkative, easy-tempered old person, very fond of her nursling, of whom she had had charge since she was a baby, and good-natured after a fashion, but vulgar-minded, and very selfish if anything came to cross her own convenience. Juliet had coaxed her into sympathy about her present affairs, and Romeo, being a very handsome, open-handed young gentleman, the nurse for the moment was on their side, and consented to act as messenger between them. But her own aches and pains were at all times more important to the old woman than the concerns of anyone else, and even when returning from her mission to settle the time of the marriage, she was more occupied in recounting her own ailments than in relieving the anxiety of her young mistress to hear news of Romeo. However, as long as things went well, she was willing to be amiable, and the young girl was at least not left entirely destitute of any confidant. But when trouble arose, the nurse's shallow, selfish nature became apparent, and poor Juliet was soon to learn that she must rely solely on her own strength and judgment in the sorrows that overwhelmed her. After the marriage, Juliet returned home, and there presently the nurse joined her. She carried the ladder of cords she had gone to fetch, but she flung it down with a gesture of despair, and her face was the picture of woe. "Ay me, what news? Why do you wring your hands?" exclaimed Juliet, a sudden chill of terror clouding the sunshine of her joy. "Ah, well-a-day! He's dead! He's dead! He's dead!" wailed the nurse. "We are undone, lady, we are undone! Alack the day! He's gone! He's killed! He's dead!" Juliet thought, of course, that the nurse referred to Romeo, especially when she went on weeping and wailing, and saying that she had seen him lying dead with her own eyes. Juliet's heart was nearly broken at the dreadful news, when suddenly the stupid old woman in her confused style began to lament. "O Tybalt, Tybalt, the best friend I had! O courteous Tybalt, honest gentleman, that ever I should live to see thee dead!" "What do you mean?" said poor bewildered Juliet. "Is Romeo slaughtered, and is Tybalt dead? My dear loved cousin and my dearer lord?" "Tybalt is gone, and Romeo banished," said the nurse. "Romeo that killed him, he is banished." Her words were plain enough now. Juliet shrank back in horror. Did Romeo's hand shed Tybalt's blood? It did! It did! Alas the day, it did! Juliet's first impulse was to heap reproaches on her newly made husband, who hid so vile a nature under so fair a seeming, but when the nurse chimed eagerly in, and said that there was no trust, no faith, no honesty in man, they were all perjured, all dissemblers, Juliet immediately changed her tone, and broke into an indignant defence of Romeo. "Will you speak well of him that killed your cousin?" asked the nurse. "Shall I speak ill of him that is my husband?" cried Juliet. "Ah, poor my lord, what tongue shall smooth thy name when I, thy 3 hours' wife, have wronged it?" Worse, far worse to her than her cousin's death was the terrible news that Romeo was banished. "Tybalt is dead, and Romeo banished!" The dreadful words kept ringing in her ears. "Romeo is banished. There is no end, no limit, measure, bound in that word's death. No words can fathom that woe," she mourned. Juliet bade the nurse carry away the ladder of cords, for it was of no use now. Romeo was exiled. She would never see him again. Death, and not Romeo, would be her husband. The old woman was melted to pity at the sight of Juliet's misery. "Go to your room," she said soothingly. "I'll find Romeo to comfort you. I know well where he is. Hark ye, your Romeo will be here at night. I'll go to him. He is hidden in Friar Lawrence's cell." "Oh, find him, give this ring to my true knight," cried Juliet, "and bid him come to take his last farewell." Forced to find a refuge after the death of Tybalt, Romeo had gone to the man who had always been a friend to him, and the good Friar Lawrence had given him shelter in his cell. He then sallied forth to learn how matters were going, and presently returned with the news of the doom that the prince had pronounced. Romeo was banished. Romeo was in despair when he heard the sentence. To him, banishment seemed worse than death. In vain the friar tried to comfort him, pointing out that the sentence was more merciful than what he had a right to expect. Romeo declared it was torture and not mercy. Heaven was here where Juliet lived, and henceforth every cat and dog and little mouse and unworthy thing might look at her, but he might not. Every creature was free, but he was banished. Was there no poison, no sharp knife, no sudden way of death, however mean, that might have killed him, that he must live on in torture, with that word, banished? The good friar tried to reason with him, but for the moment Romeo was past all reason. He refused to listen to any words of counsel, and flung himself down on the ground in a perfect frenzy of grief. At that moment there came a knocking at the outside door. "Arise, someone is knocking. Good Romeo, hide thyself," entreated the friar. But Romeo refused to stir. The knocking came again, louder and more imperative. "Hark, how they knock! Who's there? Romeo, arise, thou wilt be taken. Stay a while. Stand up. Run to my study. In a minute. Heavens, what folly is this? I come! I come!" The friar's entreaties to Romeo were mixed with broken ejaculations to the person knocking outside, but as the headstrong young man refused to move from the spot where he had flung himself down on the floor of the cell, Friar Lawrence dared no longer delay to open the door. Happily the newcomer was only Juliet's nurse, and no dangerous or inquisitive visitor. Romeo eagerly demanded news, and then in a fresh passion of remorse at the misery he had brought on his dear lady, threatened madly to kill himself, and drew his sword. The friar stayed his hand, and now began sternly to rebuke him for his frantic behaviour and unmanly lack of all self-control. Then he pointed out that he still had many blessings left to him, though he chose sullenly to ignore them. Juliet still lived. He was happy in that. The law that might have condemned him to death had it turned into exile. He was happy in that. Finally, the friar bade him go to Juliet as had been arranged, and comfort her. "But take care not to stay till the watch be set," he counselled, "for then you cannot pass to Mantua, where you shall live till we can find a time to publish your marriage, reconcile your friends, beg pardon of the prince, and call you back, with 20,000 times more joy than you went forth in lamentation." Romeo was greatly cheered by the brave words of the friar, and the nurse hurried back to Juliet with the news that her husband would soon be with her. Comfort and counsel. The second parting of Romeo and Juliet at the balcony looking into Capulet's orchard was very different from the first. Then indeed Romeo had reluctantly torn himself away, but, after all, they had another happier meeting to look forward to on the morrow. Now all was gloom and uncertainty, and who knew when they would ever see each other again? The lark, the herald of the morning, that sang joyously high overhead, the golden rays of dawn that pierced the eastern clouds, only brought sadness to the hearts of the young husband and wife, for they told that the fatal hour of parting had come. Longing to keep Romeo with her, yet dreading the peril he ran if he delayed too long, Juliet one moment implored him to stay, and the next urged him to depart. "Oh, now be gone, more light and light it grows," she sighed at last, and Romeo echoed despairingly, "More light and light, more dark and dark our woes." At this moment the nurse came hastily to warn Juliet that her mother was approaching, and now indeed Romeo must take his last farewell. As Juliet looked down to him from the balcony, it seemed to her that Romeo's face, in the grey light of dawn, looked pale as one in the bottom of a tomb, and even his cheering words that spoke of a future meeting failed to bring comfort to her breaking heart. But she had no time to brood over this sorrow, for she was now called to face another and almost more terrible trial. Lady Capulet had come to her daughter's room at this unusual hour to bring news of great importance. The County Paris had renewed his suit to Juliet's father. All was arranged. The marriage was fixed to take place in 3 days' time, on the following Thursday. It did not occur to the parents that Juliet would have any voice in the matter, or rather Lady Capulet thought it would be joyful tidings to her, and would help to console her for the death of her cousin Tybalt. She was, therefore, somewhat astonished to find the way in which her news was received. In answer to her intelligence that early next Thursday the gallant young and noble gentleman, the County Paris, at St. Peter's Church, would happily make Juliet a joyful bride, her daughter exclaimed with fire, "Now, by St. Peter's Church and Peter too, he shall not make me there a joyful bride." Juliet went on to say that she would not marry in this haste, and when she did marry it would be Romeo, their enemy, rather than Paris. Then in came Capulet, her father, and, deaf to all Juliet's pleadings, he swore in a furious rage that she should marry Paris, and if she did not, she might beg, starve, die in the streets, for he would not own her as a daughter. Juliet appealed to her mother, but Lady Capulet was really angry with her, or perhaps she did not dare go against her husband. At any rate, she took his side in the matter, and harshly refused to listen to anything Juliet might say. "Do as thou wilt, for I have done with thee," were her final cruel words, as she followed her husband from the room. Cut to the heart, stunned with misery, Juliet turned to her last hope. Her old nurse was still beside her. She, at least, knew that what her parents demanded was impossible. She knew that Juliet could not marry Paris, for she was already married to Romeo. Perhaps she could suggest some way of escape. "Comfort me, counsel me," implored the distracted young girl. "What say'st thou? Hast thou not a word of joy? Some comfort, nurse." And this is the comfort and counsel the old nurse gave. Romeo was banished, she said, and would wager anything he would never dare to come back to challenge her, or, if he did, it would have to be by stealth. Then, since the case stood as it did, she thought the best thing would be for Juliet to marry the County Paris. Oh, he was a lovely gentleman. Romeo was nothing to him. Indeed, she thought Juliet very happy in her second match, for it far excelled her first, or, if it did not, her first was dead, or he might just as well be dead as living when banished from Juliet. So spoke the selfish, base-minded old woman. Juliet looked at her fixedly. "Do you speak this from your heart?" she asked solemnly. "And from my soul too," returned the old woman, "or evil befall them." "Amen," said Juliet. "What?" "Well, you have comforted me marvellous much," said Juliet, speaking with strange calm. "Go in and tell my lady that, having displeased my father, I have gone to Friar Lawrence's cell to make confession and to be absolved." "Marry I will, and this is wisely done," said the old nurse, pottering away to fulfill her errand. Then, for a moment, Juliet's self-restraint gave way. "O most wicked fiend," she cried, in just indignation, "is it more sin to wish me to be thus forsworn, or to dispraise my lord with that same tongue with which she has praised him as above compare so many thousand times? Go, counsellor, thou and my bosom henceforth shall be twain. I will go to the friar to ask his remedy. If everything else fail, I have power myself to die." The good friar did not fail the young girl in her need, as the old nurse had done, but the way of escape he suggested was such a terrible one that none but the bravest and most faithful heart could ever have consented to it. Juliet's position, however, was so desperate, and she was so determined to be true to Romeo, that she would have died rather than have married Paris, and now she declared she was ready to go down to the gates of death itself, if only she might live a true wife to Romeo. Seeing her resolution, Friar Lawrence went on to describe his plan. The marriage was to take place 2 days hence, on the Thursday. On the Wednesday night, Juliet, when she went to bed, was to drink off the contents of a phial, which the friar would give her. This was a very strong sleeping draught, which would make her lie exactly like dead, pale as ashes, stiff and cold, for 42 hours, after which she would awaken as if from a pleasant sleep. On the Thursday morning, when they came to rouse her for the marriage, they would find her apparently dead, and then, according to the custom of the country, in her best robes, uncovered on the bier, she would be borne to the ancient vault of the Capulets. In the meantime, before she woke, news would be sent to Romeo to tell him everything. He would come back to Verona, and he and Friar Lawrence would watch beside Juliet in the vault until she awoke, and that very same night Romeo should convey her away to Mantua. This was the desperate plan which the friar suggested, and which Juliet's love for her husband gave her strength to accept and carry out. With unflinching courage she seized the little phial, while Friar Lawrence went immediately to dispatch a speedy messenger to Mantua with letters to Romeo. All through the night before the marriage there was bustle and stir in the household of the Capulets. Great preparations were being made for the festivities, and Capulet himself was up all night, urging forward the servants, and hurrying them here and there about their different tasks. As the moments sped by, he became more and more excited, and when the musicians arrived to serenade the bride on her wedding morning, he shouted to the nurse to go and waken Juliet at once and get her dressed. "Hi, make haste," he said. "I'll go and chat with Paris. Make haste, make haste. The bridegroom, he has come already. Make haste, I say." So the nurse went to Juliet's chamber. How calm and restful was everything here! Not a contrast to the rush and noisy confusion outside the closed door. Not a sound broke the stillness, not a rustle of movement showed that any living creature was an inmate of the room. Behind those drawn curtains the bride slept well. But she must rouse herself now, the time for slumber is past. She must shake off the heaviness from her dreaming eyes, she must leave this peaceful haven of her childhood. Her happy girlish days are over and done with. The wedding feast is set, the guests are assembling, the bridegroom is waiting. Wake, Juliet, awaken! Shout, nurse, wail for sorrow, and wring your hands. Call louder, the bride does not hear you. Weep, mother, for the child whom you turned from when living. Mourn, father, for the daughter you rejected and disowned. There in her bridal robes lies the bride upon her bed, pale as ashes, stiff and cold. The snowy whiteness of her wedding raiment is not more white than her face. Her closed eyes smile back no greeting to the rising sun. The little phial has done its work. Here at the door stands the bridegroom, but to the mourners in that desolate chamber it seems that a mightier than he has stepped before him and claimed the bride, and the name of that bridegroom is Death.